Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces a critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. In an era of rising geopolitical tensions and rapid technological advancements, the security of our space based assets has become more imperative than ever. At this juncture, countries are looking to develop measures to protect their space based assets from anti satellite weapons, cyber attacks, and other space based as well as Earth based threats. Further, they're also looking to forge partnerships with like minded countries to bolster their capabilities. Today, we are going to discuss about current developments in space security, identifying the opportunities for India and the US in this area of space cooperation. Joining us today to discuss this topic is Victoria Samson. Victoria Samson is the Chief Director for Space Security and Stability at the Secure World Foundation in the US. She has over 25 years of experience in military space and security issues and has earlier served as a senior analyst for Center for Defense Information with expertise in missile defense, nuclear reductions, and space security. She was also a senior policy associate at the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, a consortium of arms control groups in Washington, D.C., where she worked with U.S. congressional staffers, members of the media, embassy officials, citizens, and think tanks on issues related to ballistic missile defense and nuclear weapons reduction. Before that, she was a researcher at Riverside Research Institute, where she worked on wargaming scenarios for the Missile Defense Agency's Directorate of Intelligence. Victoria, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you for having me.
So, Victoria, my first question is, what is space security and what are its correlations with space sustainability?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think oftentimes people try and divide out space security from space sustainability, whereas I argue they're two sides of the same coin. Um, I guess that brings down to, what is space sustainability? In my opinion, it's our ability to use space over the long term. How do we get the benefits from space for life on this planet? And so anything for space security, anything that disrupts or interferes or somehow disturbs the stability and predictability of the space domain, I think that could have negative consequences on space sustainability. So I think oftentimes people also tend to think about space security. Okay, you must be talking about weapons. I mean, you can be talking about weapons, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that more later on today. But really and truly, it can be anything that threatens your ability to utilize space. So it can be weapons, it can be irresponsible actions, it can even be misunderstood ideas and behaviors.
Thank you very much. So you talked about irresponsible behaviors and weapons in the outer space. So recently we have seen a lot of instances where rendezvous and proximity operations, cyber attacks on satellites, and also other areas or activities that are kind of throwing caution to this concept of space security. At this juncture, can you also give us a brief picture on the current developments in space security and why it is becoming a priority for both space as well as non-spacefaring countries?
Sure. I think it's a couple processes happening at the same time. First of all, more and more countries are having space wrapped into their national security, into their economic well-being. And so there's more an incentive for their adversaries to disrupt, deny, degrade, somehow interfere with their space assets. But at the same time, we're seeing geopolitical competition extend itself out into space. And that part isn't new. I mean, I think the whole history of the space age is a demonstration of that. But I think it's those two things coming together that you're starting to see more research and development and work being done on activities that could interfere with space assets. And that could be done, as you said, rendezvous and proximity operations, which is the idea of getting up close to another country's satellite. Or even what we've seen sometimes is that countries will undertake rendezvous and proximity operations with their own satellites. But the thinking is they're developing some sort of capacity that could then be used later on. And of course, the concern from a security viewpoint for rendezvous and proximity operations is that if you're getting up close to another country's satellite, sure, you might just be getting up close to, gather intelligence to see what the satellite looks like, maybe to listen in on what that satellite's listening in or see what that satellite's broadcasting. But you can also get up close to interfere with that satellite, whether that's physically by releasing a projectile at a high speed, whether that's using an arm to interfere with the satellite, or even just something like jamming, so the satellite can no longer receive or broadcast signals. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing, I will say there's only really 3 countries right now that are doing rendezvous and proximity operations around other countries' satellites, and that's the United States, Russia, and China. We're seeing as well more countries develop capabilities that can do direct ascent anti-satellite weapons. The idea that you have an interceptor on the ground that's launched against your own satellite, we've only seen that to date. Countries are doing these tests against their own satellites. And right now, 4 countries have developed those capabilities. Again, the United States, Russia, China, and then India in 2019 held its own anti-satellite test. And then we're seeing as well just more investment in space, right? We're seeing, the United States, its commercial sector is becoming very prevalent. You see China developing a commercial space sector. You see India, having their first rendezvous and proximity attempt with the space tug. So you're seeing more investment and more new activities happening in space. Your development of active debris removal technologies, the idea of going up and taking down a piece of debris so it's no longer a threat to other actors in orbit. So far, the only countries that's done that is China with one of its satellites in geostationary orbit, but Japan is working on an active debris removal mission. The Swiss are as well. And again, it's one of those things where it's a dual capability technology where it can be done, it can be developed for reasons that are completely innocuous. You're trying to help maintain the safety and sustainability of an orbit by removing pieces of debris. Or you could be developing capabilities that could actually be used against other countries' satellites. Really, it's the intention, not the technology, that matters here. And it's very hard to demonstrate good intent. So you have a circumstance where you have all these technologies that could go either way. You have geopolitical competition happening, and it's happening in a domain that's far away and hard to keep an eye on.
Right. Thank you very much. That was really insightful. So you kind of identified a broad or different types of, I would kind of encompass like counter space measures, right? And the Secure World Foundation every year brings out this very interesting report on mapping the counter space measures developed by different countries. Right. So essentially, why do you think that the countries are looking to develop them? And I understand that they would like to kind of develop some kind of deterrence, some kind of self defense. But even in terms of aggression and in terms of activities that are looking to kind of disrupt or destroy the satellite, why do you think that countries are looking to develop these counter space measures?
Yeah, thanks for allowing me the opportunity to talk about Secure World's Global Counterspace Threat Assessment. My boss will be very happy. So that, as you said, that's an annual report that we put out every year looking at counterspace capabilities across 5 different categories. We look at co-orbital, where the idea that the spacecraft or the weapon system gets up into space, goes into orbit, and then does whatever it's going to do to interfere with the other country's satellites, whether that's to jam, or to release a nuclear weapon, or to just get up close and conduct rendezvous and proximity operations, or, like I said before, releasing a projectile at high speed, any of those things. Then you have direct ascent anti-satellite weapons. Again, this is a terrestrial-based interceptor that's launched either from the ground or from air or from the ocean to directly kinetically impact a satellite and destroy it. And then we look at directed energy weapons, anything that's like lasers, things like you may have heard about stories about Russia developing a nuclear warhead that could be used in an anti-satellite capacity, the electromagnetic pulse, the EMP that's released from a nuclear detonation, that would be considered a directed energy weapon. Then things like electronic warfare, basically radio frequency interference, jamming and spoofing, which frankly everyone does. And then finally, cyber attacks. Again, something that some sort of software that can interfere with your ability to utilize space, whether that's going against the ground terminals or going against the satellites in orbit or interfering with communication to or from space. So we look at those 5 counter space capabilities, and I define them here just because I think other organizations that look at space threats. They define threats differently. Everyone has their own interpretation of this. But we look at those 5 counter space capabilities for 12 countries. When we first started this report in 2018, we did 6 countries, and now 2025, almost a decade later, we've doubled it. And frankly, every year there's a couple countries that I have my eye on. I'm like, maybe this will be your year. Maybe we need to add you. And one of the countries, we include the United States as part of our counter space threat assessment, which for a lot of Western analyses of space threats, they do not include the United States. But we felt it was important to include the United States to really get a holistic view of the space domain. So the way we organize it is we have countries that have conducted direct descent anti-satellite tests or destructive anti-satellite tests. And we do it in the chronological order in which those tests were held. So the first country to do an anti-satellite test was the United States. And then we have 1959. And then we have Russia / in the Soviet years, 1963. Then we have China in 2007, and then India in 2019. And then we have the rest of the countries. Those are done alphabetically. So, I think there's more of an incentive, as I said, for countries to develop these sort of capabilities. Partially, it's because space is a key national security enabler. And so there's a concern about mission assurance and resiliency, and the idea that if you develop these sort of counter space capabilities, you can assure that you'll have continued access to space. I am not clear about that, but I think it's more the idea it's meant to be used, even though there's supposedly a lot of these are defensive in nature, they're meant to be used offensively. They're meant to be able to prevent adversaries from being able to utilize space in national security missions. And so I think as more countries depend upon space, there's, like I said, there's more of an incentive to do this, develop these sort of capabilities.
Right. So I just add a follow-up question to that. A space lawyer in the room as well. So Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty is not clear as to the placement of, conventional weapons in the outer space. So can we also bring in the ambit of counter space measures to have an impact on terrestrial activities?
So Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty is pretty clear. It says you cannot place nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in orbit.
Yes.
And that was done deliberately during the time when they negotiated it in the 1960s. Both the United States and the Soviet Union, I wouldn't say wanted, but anticipated that there could be a situation where we would be shooting ICBMs at each other in a nuclear conflict. And the idea was we wanted to be able to have ICBMs tipped with nuclear warheads to be able to pass through space. And that's why it's very clear, as long as it doesn't go into orbit, it's legal. And as you said, Tejas, it doesn't prevent conventional weapons from being placed into space. So it doesn't talk about anything about behavior, because again, this is a long time ago, 1967 Outer Space Treaty. They're much more focused on weapons in more traditional arms control perspective. So I think that is something that, when we're looking at the future of, space security, how do you define what is considering threatening behavior? Because that's really going to be a challenge. Again, the Outer Space Treaty has guidelines and principles, acting with due regard, no harmful interference, but it really, like with any legal document, it's the interpretation of that. Truly it depends on how it's interpreted for how you deal with circumstances. I'm sorry, I forgot the rest of your question.
Oh, thanks. That was, that is very much clear, and it kind of gave us a clarity on, where the developments are. So, we understood right now that the space is becoming highly contested, and there have also been discourses on astropolitics, that is an extension of geopolitics into space. And as the world is becoming fragmented on values and on positions, countries right now are looking to identify trusted partners to kind of build capacities, bolster their abilities and resilience to protect their space assets. How do you think the US has approached space security in the last few years? And where do you see international partnerships play in this regard?
So the U.S. has approached it a couple different ways. Some of it is bringing international partners into exercises that allow space forces to look at different scenarios and figure out how they respond in times of conflict. And, the Shriver War Games, I think, is a very obvious example of that. But there is other other options, Operational Olympic Defender. There's one specifically for countries in Latin America. And so I think as, the U.S. is bringing in more of its allies and partners into these exercises, it's a way in which to bring our military thinking together and to bring, operationally how we would function in times of conflict. We're seeing this as well in terms of kind of big picture sharing, space situational awareness, or SSA sharing. These idea of keeping track of objects on orbit so that you can get warnings about potential close approaches or conjunctions. For example, the United States and India signed an SSA sharing agreement a few years ago, and that allows to exchange data and share information in more military sensitive ways. You see things like the Quad, which is the United States, India, Japan, and Australia trying to work together on exchanging information on military issues. We see this in terms of NATO developing, policies on space. Of course, the United States, who knows? The United States for now is part of NATO. Who knows how it's going to change under this administration? Things. Yeah. It's been a weird month and a half. But yeah, so we're seeing these exchanges with military officers. We're seeing exchanges of data. We're seeing agreements being signed. We're seeing the formation of the Quad, and then other things too. You see, it's being these sort of international cooperative efforts are being done in civil space. For example, the Artemis Accords, which is being run by, officially it's a NASA State Department program where, the United States has identified principles of the Outer Space Treaty that it believes are crucial for the future peaceful exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies. As we continue to expand outward into our solar system, how can we do so in a manner that's peaceful and sustainable? So the United States has been seeking other countries to sign on to its vision of this. And I will say India signed the Artemis Accords a year or two back. And I think we're at like 53 countries that have signed the Artemis Accords so far. That's a way in which to build up allies and partners. And again, kind of agreeing that there's different ways in which to think about how you approach space exploration and say, well, these are the values that we look at. And then finally, I would say that there are discussions in multilateral fora on space security and stability, specifically in the Conference of Disarmament. There's been a whole series of discussions. I mean, I won't bore you stupid. I won't bore you stupid with the various UN, open-ended working group and group of experts and blah, blah. But there's been discussions, let's put it that way, on responsible behavior and how do you get that, common understanding what's considered responsible behavior in space, and how do you identify it, and what sort of behaviors do you want to see, and how do you call it out? And so the United States has been working with its allies and partners to kind of get a common understanding of these sort of behaviors so that we can get that sort of behavior proliferated and, understood and hopefully implemented globally.
Interesting, right? Kind of taking the spotlight off, US and the Europe and bringing the spotlight back to my home, that is India. So both India and the US have witnessed growing convergence in space cooperation in both civilian as well as military space realms, like you mentioned. Both countries have a space security dialogue. They have signed a basic exchange and cooperation agreement for geospatial intelligence sharing in 2020. Like you said, they have a space situational awareness arrangement that was signed in 2022. And this area of cooperation has also, witnessed, boosting since the launch of the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, as well as the Indus X framework in 2023. Now, as India emerged as an important partner for the US in space security, what is your take on that?
I think India is definitely an important partner of the United States in space security, just because I think the U.S. is striving to get regional counterbalances to China, and India serves as an excellent category for that. The U.S. and India, relatively recent partners on these sort of things. I think we're still coming out of decades of the Cold War, where India saw itself as a counterbalance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so it's kind of hard to make that shift. But as well, I think India still has strong ties to Russia. which is uncomfortable for the United States, particularly given the interconnectedness of Russian military technology with Indian military technology. And so I think that's going to be a complicating factor. But, like everything, everything is a challenge and nothing's easy. And I think, given that the U.S. and India have made efforts recently, as you detailed, to increase our ties and make it easy for us to share technology, that there is a hope that we can, work together on making sure that space is secure and stable and predictable for all.
Thank you. We also witnessed the emergence of private space sector, right? So, where do you think that this emergence of private space sector, ever since the kind of the new space dimension that has evolved in the last few years, right? How has this emergence of private space sector changed space security, the concept? We have SpaceX that's kind of operating Starlink. We also have many companies that are kind of involved in space sustainability as well as space security activities. Some of them are now providing space situational awareness services, including entities from India that have, just recently, a space situational awareness company in India commissioned its, mission to kind of, procure space situational awareness data. So, how has this changed the entire emergence of private space sector?
Well, it's had a huge effect on overall space governance. I will say, the private sector has been a part of space almost from the very beginning of the space age. If you're going back into the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, Article 6 requires countries to provide continuing supervision to national activities in space. And that was done specifically as a compromise. And the United States wanted the private sector to be in space. The Soviet Union did not recognize private sector, didn't say, and said it definitely should not be in space. And so this was kind of a way in which to allow both to be content with how this would function. So, since this is dating back to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, you can recognize the private sector has been a big part of space, since then, if not before then, until now. What we're seeing, though, is a big shift in terms of, the nature of space. While the private sector has been part of space, the primary actors in space, in the space domain, were nation states. Nationals, and maybe the U.S. would be an actor, and the United States military would have Lockheed Martin build satellites, but they were U.S. military satellites. Just the provider was commercial sector. But over the past almost 6 years now, we've seen a huge change, and that's really been with the launch of very large constellations. And really and truly, when we talk about very large constellations, what we're talking about is SpaceX's Starlink. We've gone from a point where I think there's roughly 11,000 active satellites. Of those, 7,000 plus are from one entity, and it's not a nation state; it's a commercial actor. It's SpaceX Starlink, and so that's just a huge shift. We have, the primary actor is not a nation state, and that's important from a governance perspective because space is a shared domain. And when you have concerns about security issues in a shared domain, what do? You go to the United Nations. You have these discussions in multilateral fora, but the discussants there are nation states. They're not commercial actors. And so you can see that this disruption is complicated because it upends our governance model, and we're trying to catch up with it and having a bit of a challenge. As well, you're seeing Starlink getting involved in geopolitics. From the very beginning, it was used in the war in Ukraine, and at first it was being used, given for free by SpaceX to Ukraine to be able to have military communications. And then suddenly, after a year or so, when Elon Musk thought that it might be inflammatory, then they cut off some of the access, and now we're seeing it being used as a tool, a cudgel against the Ukrainians, where if they don't do what the United States wants, they might cut off their Starlink access. But you also see commercial actors being used in Ukraine for non-Starlink reasons. They're Earth observation companies. They've been a huge commercial Earth observation companies. Have been a huge role in terms of how Ukrainians and the Russians are identifying targets and keeping track of troop movements and things like that. You're seeing as well, as you said, SSA, commercial SSA providers used to be the only sources of SSA, space situational awareness capabilities, were government entities. And frankly, it was the U.S. military mostly keeping track of objects in orbit, and then sending out potential close approaches or conjunction warnings to all space actors. This is done as a matter of spaceflight safety, and the U.S. sent and continues to send these conjunction warnings to literally all actors. So these include Russian, Chinese, anyone. And again, as a matter of making sure that there aren't accidents or collisions in space that create debris that makes it difficult for everyone to function. But now you have commercial SSA companies. You have Western, and you have, as you said, an Indian company, Digitara. It launched its first satellite about a month or so back and has its own radars and telescopes. And so with these alternative sources of SSA, I think it's helpful in the grand scheme of things because, the more data you have, the better picture you have overall of the entire space environment. But it also complicates things because, you can have different interpretations of where things are. Every SSA system may say, well, the satellite is in a slightly different position. How do you know, what's the truth there in terms of satellites? And this is important. If you think there might be a close approach to your satellite and you have multiple SSA systems giving you different opinions, well, which one do you take and how do you know which one to listen to? Then you have as well, with commercial SSA companies involved, they can suddenly, see things that perhaps the U.S. military would not want them to see. And, that's kind of a vestigial holdover from the Cold War. Back in the day, when the U.S. really was the only one with these sort of SSA sensors, we could say, okay, that satellite is classified, and so we're just not even going to acknowledge that it exists. And now, they're still part of the U.S. security establishment that likes to think we can still do that, but we can't. If anyone with a good iPhone can point your camera up at the night sky and identify satellites going overhead, you may not know exactly what the satellites are, but their physical existence, the fact that they're there, that can't be classified because anyone can see it. There's no point. And so I think that, can be a discomfort at some points. But also we have as well now, even commercial space developing space counter space capabilities. There's a company in the United States called True Anomaly, which is working on developing rendezvous and proximity operations with a target and a chaser satellite that they're doing activities for. The French are developing kind of the same thing. They're using a commercial actor to do that. So we're starting to see it's not just the U.S. Military is developing these capabilities. You see the commercial sector be like, oh, this is something that people pay for. We'll provide this sort of capabilities, and that has consequences for overall security.
Right, that's very interesting trend that you brought out because I imagine in 2022 in the open-ended working group, Russia making a statement that if they didn't name the company though, but they said that if private space companies are offering telecommunication and satellite communication services to Ukraine, then they would also be regarded as a legitimate military object, right? So it kind of brings into the picture of what kind of a role that a private space company can play in space security, and if in the future, they can also be kind of regarded as legitimate military objects, leading to more escalation in the outer space. And also, what is the role of Article 6 here in the Outer Space Treaty? I mean, with regards to the US and also other spacefaring countries, how are they looking to kind of regulate this private space sector's role in space security?
Well, as you said, Russia and China, they both made statements about, Western, commercial satellites being used in military operations or, interfering, and that they could become targets themselves. I mean, that's just, an uncomfortable truth, frankly. If commercial companies, if their satellites are being used in military conflicts by the combatants, they are lawful targets. Like, it's not a question. But what is a question? Just because you're a lawful target doesn't mean that you can be attacked, as much as the other country wants to. There's still, international humanitarian law absolutely applies to space. This is most countries agree with that. The only countries that have said they don't agree with that is Russia, China, and Iran. And we're talking the CD, but pretty much every other country says international humanitarian law applies to space. And so for something to be a lawful target, there's other things you have to meet. You have to say, okay, does it meet a military objective? Is it necessary? Can you distinguish between combatants and non-combatants? There's all sorts of things there. You can't just because it's a lawful target doesn't mean you can come out of guns blazing. But it is a consideration. I will say both the U.S. Department of Defense And the Space Force last year released commercial integration strategies. And that was one of the considerations they had. Okay, if we're going to be having commercial actors helping out with national security missions, how do we handle it if and when they get targeted? Basically, it comes down to contracts. You write in the contract that they're going to be compensated. You need to figure out to what extent, but still, it's something to think about. And then in terms of Article 6 obligations, when it's interesting in the United States, when I hear people talk about Article 6, and basically it's mission authorization, that's what they're talking about when they talk about Article 6 obligations. They're not looking at it so much in terms of space security issues, although maybe they should. But really what they're talking about is, okay, as we do new novel activities in space, how do we authorize these sort of activities and follow Article 6 obligations? An example I would give for that of a circumstance where we didn't have the mission authorization and it was a complication. About a little over a year ago, there was a U.S. commercial company that had launched a spacecraft that was going to go to the moon. And they were carrying a bunch of different payloads. One of the payloads was human cremated remains. So the idea that they're going to place it on the moon, and that became pretty controversial because some cultures see the moon as a religious place and didn't want to have cremains there. But this is a commercial actor doing it. And so the challenge was, well, how do we do mission authorization for this? NASA doesn't do that. It's a civil agency and it doesn't do that sort of thing. And we found out there was kind of a gap in our regulatory mechanisms to be able to handle this. And so the U.S. is still scrambling to do what we call mission authorization, but it's for those sort of activities, not necessarily for space security type stuff.
Right. Thank you very much for the clarification. And coming back, kind of bringing the spotlight back to India, we are seeing increasing collaboration between both governments and also the private sector. Like you said, that private sector is playing a very important role in space security. So, for example, in India and in the US, both the defense innovation organizations are working on joint challenges under the INDEX framework. And the current set of challenges is on satellite tracking in low Earth orbit. Further, we are also seeing a lot of collaboration between governments and industries. For example, the U.S. Space Force has signed a cooperative research and development agreement with two Indian startups for innovation in Earth observation sensors and space domain awareness. There are also accelerators that are working with Indian space startups to facilitate joint working with the U.S. Department of Defense. Looking at all these developments, what are the current opportunities and challenges that you see for both countries and private sector to work on space security? When I kind of think of both India and the US to work on space security, including the private space sector.
Yeah, I think the first thing you mentioned is really going to be the most important one. The idea of satellite tracking in low Earth orbit, or basically threat detection. That's one of the big issues that the United States is concerned about, and given the strength of the Indian commercial space sector that is developing specifically along those lines, and that India is developing its own SSA system through Project Netra, I feel like this is probably a good way in which for our two countries to work together on these sort of capabilities. That's one of the, as the United States looks to carry out what I guess we're calling Golden Dome now, the idea that we're having a missile defense shield for the entire continental United States. I have a lot of questions about that, but one of the things I don't question is the need to develop better threat detection, and threat tracking capabilities. And I think that's important to get a true sense of the space domain and the threat environment. And that's something I think the United States and India can work closely on.
Right. Thank you. And I also wanted to kind of bring this question up since you're the expert in the room. I've been to a lot of conferences, a lot of debates where they interchangeably use space domain awareness with space situational awareness. Right? Can you kind of give me a difference as to what these two terminologies are?
Yeah, to be honest, I just use SSA out of sheer spite because I think that SDA. Officially, space domain awareness. All right, let me back up. Officially, SSA is tracking objects in orbit, and SDA is making assumptions or doing analysis based on what we think those objects are doing. The reason why and so there's kind of a military or defense component to SDA, whereas SSA can be just even just a matter of space flight safety, that sort of thing. The reason why I call everything SSA is that, concepts change. About 10 years ago, the U.S. used to call it SST, Space Surveillance and Tracking.
Yeah.
And then they said, we're going to switch it to SSA, Space Situation Awareness, because we want to include the analytical approach and we want to include the analysis, not just know where objects are, but to do analysis on them. So it's just one of those things. It's a trendy way of calling these things. I just even read last week, I read an article where the U.S. is putting up satellites with own ship awareness. I'm like, oh my God, another one. And so this is the idea that the satellites can keep themselves can look at other objects around them and be aware of what's approaching their satellites. And they just keep coming up with new stuff. So, I mean, I think it's just more a matter of the military folks tend to use SDA and the non-military folks tend to use SSA. But in the grand scheme of things, I think they're pretty similar.
Yes, thank you. Also, I kind of be a little creative here and would ask you to put the think tanking hat on and probably kind of give us a take on what are the new opportunities for collaboration you see kind of, between both these countries emerge on space security. You have a joint challenge on space object tracking in place. But are there any other new initiatives that both these countries can think of? Something that's out of the box, something that's new, something that's interesting. Just would like to pick your brain on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's more value in working cooperatively on efforts that will lead to overall stability of the space domain. And so things like, cooperative efforts on monitoring space weather, for example, I think that's very important. Things like cooperative efforts on figuring out how to work together on the moon, and so that we don't have, the U.S., India, and China all landing in the same sites near the South Pole. I think things like that are going to be very helpful in the grand scheme of things. I don't know necessarily that developing new weapon systems is going to end up having the result that we would like. It's just more a matter of what can, we want a stable and predictable domains to continue to get the benefits of space. How do we do that? And investments in space science and space weather. Looking at cislunar research, cislunar SSA, coordination of activities on and around the moon. I think those can have huge payoffs for space security and stability that will then have geopolitical benefits as well.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And in one of your earliest, kind of answers, you also mentioned the importance of norms, right? So the importance of identifying and promoting norms for responsible behavior in outer space, right? And like you rightly said, there have been discussions at the UN in Geneva, right? Do you kind of see any opportunities for both countries to collaborate on normative aspects of space security? And how do you kind of think that this normative convergence or divergence will affect the space security partnership between both these countries?
Well, I will say at these discussions in Geneva, the United States and its allies have been pushing for norms of behavior. India is open to the idea of norms of behavior, but India historically has preferred legally binding initiatives in terms of threats to space security. I think that there's starting to be a common understanding amongst actors. It doesn't have to be norms of behavior or legally binding. It can be both. One may lead to the other. As for example, we had a series of UN General Assembly resolutions in the 1960s that eventually became codified in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. It doesn't have to, but it can lead to each other. They can underline each other. They can be working complementarily. But one way in which, a norm that the United States and a bunch of its allies have done is the idea the United States, 3 years ago, the United States made a commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests, with the idea that the debris that's created from these sort of tests is a real challenge. It's been some of the biggest sources of debris causing incidents in recent years. So far, 38 countries have made this commitment. India has not. And it's been one of those things where, if you're looking at a norm of behavior, I think that this is a great way in which for India to demonstrate, regional leadership and thought leadership on these issues and making this commitment as well, because it's a way of identifying that this is responsible behavior that we want to see everyone do and sign on to. So that's one way in which I can see, them working together on that.
Right. Interestingly, the Indian government has not made a commitment, but I do see that some Indian companies have they're part of that commitment to not be part
So
of. Yeah.
yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but thank you. That also allows me to bring up. So my organization, the Secure World Foundation, we wanted to demonstrate that this commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests is important not just for countries of the world, because again, every single person on this planet is a user of space data in some way, shape, or form. So it's to everyone's benefit not to have that disrupted or interfered with by deliberately creating debris in orbit. But we want to demonstrate it's important to the commercial sector too. They are investing huge amount of money and resources and capabilities and time and energy into products that you don't want to immediately be put into an environment that's going to be, cluttered, for lack of a better expression. One example I would give of that is when Russia conducted its anti-satellite tests in November 2021. It created over 1,800 pieces of trackable debris, and basically, due to the orbital plane it was in, for months, every single remote sensing satellite in sun-synchronous orbit was threatened with thousands of close approaches of pieces of debris. This is a real challenge. So my organization, Secure World Foundation, we we coordinated an industry statement of support. This commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests. So far, we released it in November 2023. As of just recently, we have now 54 companies from 17 countries that have signed on to this. We do have one Indian company, Digitara. We would love to have more Indian companies sign on, again, to demonstrate that there is an interest in a stable, predictable space environment, and having these debris-causing anti-satellite tests does not lend to that. So open to that if anyone's interested.
I mean, yeah,
always don't have to be closing, right?
yeah, it's out on the plate there for the Indian companies and industry representatives listening. Yeah, do reach out to Victoria.
Please do.
Uh, so you also kind of interestingly mentioned, when you're talking about future possibilities, you're talking about the military utility of cislunar space and also activities on celestial bodies. I do understand that some of the activities, like military activities on celestial bodies, are in contention of possibly violating international laws such as Article 4, Clause 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. So, in these interesting testing times, like where do you see the future of space security go?
Yeah, I mean, so Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty says, in addition to not placing weapons of mass destruction in orbit, it says you cannot have any military installations on moon or other celestial bodies. So no military bases on the moon if you're following the Outer Space Treaty. But I think it's important, again, as we continue to evolve our use of space and have new actors and new activities, and not just in space, but on the moon. We've gone from having only, 3 countries on the moon to now 5 countries and 2 commercial landers. There's been a huge change. And if you look at everything that's going on in the moon over the next decade or so, we're looking at dozens of missions by multiple countries. And so I think it's really helpful if we're going to try and extend these principles of peace and stability and cooperation to new activities. The moon is a great testing ground for that sort of behavior and figuring out, okay, how do these things apply once we're out of past Earth orbit? I think it's important. I don't know necessarily. I know some people are like, oh, humans need to get off planet Earth and get out in the solar system. I don't necessarily believe that, but I recognize there's value to be had in, conducting research and scientific missions in the moon and beyond. And if we're going to do so, we should do so in a manner that is sustainable and peaceful and cooperative. And, figuring out how we're going to handle these sort of things, I think are important, not just for space security, but for sustainability overall.
Right. Do you see any kind of a space security threat that the space law, space policy community is not talking much about? That's going to be a bigger threat in the future. It can be AI, it can be quantum. But do you kind of think any of such space threats which deserve more attention from the policy community?
Yes, but it's not going to be as exotic as what you're talking about. Russia. I really believe Russia is a real concern. We have, if you look at the number of active satellites the United States has about 8,000 plus active satellites. China has about 1,000. Russia has about 300. Russia is going from, being a true leader, a global leader in space capabilities. During the Cold War, the United States like to think, well, we won the Cold War and we won the space race. We didn't win the space race. The Russians were the first ones to launch the first satellite, the first to get the first man in orbit, the first woman in orbit, the first spacewalk, all these firsts. The United States did get a person on the moon first, but, the global leader, all these first, to the point now where the Russian civil space program is in tatters. It really is. They're having a lot of quality control issues. They're having problems with corruption. Even before they invaded Ukraine in February 2022, in the fall of 2021, a law was passed that Russians could not talk about their civil space program with foreigners. I mean, that's not a program that's doing well. And we see this as well, with the International Space Station. It's built specifically. You have the Russian side, you have the quote unquote U.S. side, which, it's U.S. and European Space Agency and Canadians and Japanese and Brits. But, basically it's created to work together. There's a lot of issues going on. The ISS is old and it can't last forever. And, in fact, it will come down at some point, 2030 or before. But when that goes, that has been a great diplomatic tool, a way to do outreach and create connections to Russian scientists and, the space program, independent of what's happening geopolitically. And when the ISS goes, we won't have that anymore. And so you have a Russia that has a failing civil space program. They keep saying, oh, we're going to build our own space station. Good luck with that. You don't have the funding. You don't have the technology. They can't. They just don't have the resources. They don't have a commercial space sector, and that's partially due just to the legacy of the Soviets, as I mentioned earlier, just not acknowledging them as a private sector in space. The only place where Russia is still truly a global leader is its military space capabilities, and we've seen Russia is willing to invade other countries, on the ground. They're pouring a ton of resources into counter space capabilities, starting up programs that have been mothballed after the Cold War ended, conducting anti-satellite tests, doing very close approaches, that sort of thing. And they don't have as much to lose. And that's what I'm concerned about. I think in the U.S., we tend to focus a lot on China, which, understandable why. But I think people have been sleeping on Russia, and that really worries me a lot.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria. I think this was a really long but very insightful podcast. We hope that our listeners understood the relevance of space security, the trends in space security, and the opportunities for both India as well as the US to collaborate in this domain. We also understood the normative aspects in the end a little bit. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also find us on social media at Twitter, formerly Twitter, X, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.